Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us. This is a very special 15th episode of Specialty Talks. And in this conversation, we want to be talking about India's developer ecosystem. So, India has millions of developers, and we at Special have been observing that open source contributions from India over the past few years has been increasing, but clearly not enough. And we've been trying to learn as much as we can about this ecosystem. And who better to discuss this with than Kailash Nath? And Kailash has been deeply associated with the developer ecosystem all the way since he was 13 years of age. And Kailash does not really need any introduction, but I'll try anyway. So, hobbyist developer, open source contributor, and a freelance consultant since he was 13 years of age. Kailash found himself, in his own words, through a chain of events and a lot of serendipity, as the first tech person and then eventually CTO at Zerodha. I think Zerodha is extremely impressive, but also unconventional and unique in its approach to product, team, and org building. And I'm so excited to learn from Kailash's experiences through the course of this conversation. Moderating this discussion is Arjun Rao, co-founder and partner at Special. Arjun, over to you.
Good afternoon. Super excited for this conversation at Specialty Talks today. Like Ankita has mentioned, slightly unconventional guest in terms of typical venture world, the tech world that we have, but have built phenomenal products, great background in the developer ecosystem in open source. Right, Kailash, welcome to the show. Really excited to have you and today's conversation on variety of topics on the ecosystem. You want to give a quick background about how you got into development, into coding, and into the open source ecosystem? And then, of course, your transition into Zerodha.
Thank you for the invite. And like Ankita said, I started out as a developer quite early on. It wasn't planned. And I discovered the idea of programming, coding when I was around 13 years old. But I didn't really realize its implications. I think this was the year 2000, perhaps. Didn't realize its implications. So I just found it fascinating and exciting. And prior to that, I was always a tinkerer. I tinkered with science projects, little electronics. So it was just natural for me to just extend into and stumble upon programming. So it just really started out like that, and I kept on doing it. I then figured out what open source was, again, very organically. I'd copy paste code and snippets I'd find on the internet on my system, tweak, learn, do trial and error, and share stuff back on the internet over dial-up. So I think a year later or so of doing this way of learning, I figured that I was participating in what is called as open source. And it just clicked. It felt very natural to me. How else could you even learn stuff? You need to read code. You need to be able to change, modify. So then that happened, and I started working on open source projects. I think I released my first open source project. It was a blog publishing platform, one of the earliest on the World Wide Web, in fact, in 2002. And it had reasonable amounts of traction. I think there were hundreds of thousands of installations of this platform at one point. And then I figured that it's possible to build software for others over the internet and get paid for it. And I stumbled upon the whole concept of freelancing, and I started making a very modest income. And mid-2000s, I left India. I ended up in the UK, again, by sheer coincidence. It was unplanned. Spent 6 years there at the university, and I did a BSc in computer science and a PhD in a subset of artificial intelligence. And all that while, I continued working on my personal projects, open source projects. And when I finished my education, I came back to return home immediately because that was the plan. And my plan was to sit at home, work on hobby projects, work on open source project, and make a living doing freelance work online. That was literally the plan. And I'm from Kerala, so I'd gone back to Kerala only to immediately realize that the internet there really sucked. So someone told me that Bangalore has good internet, and I immediately moved to Bangalore. I think this was late 2011. And I ended up in South Bangalore. I did whatever I was doing sitting in South Bangalore over decent internet, 8 Mbps. And by sheer coincidence, I ended up meeting Nitin. He had founded Zerodha in 2010. And he also, his office, his home was all in the same vicinity. So purely because of coincidental geographical proximity, we ended up meeting each other. And I have no background in finance, neither a lot of interest, but it was a green field. This was 2012. I figured finance was a green field, and for an engineer, a green field is always exciting. There was no technology work happening at all in finance, and I figured it'd be an amazing opportunity to build new things, and engineers constantly want to build new things. And Nitin and we got along well. So that's how Zerodha Technology happened in 2013, with no clear goals, but just to digitize and bring technology to what was an industry that seemed to entirely lack technology or innovation. And this was also a period where we were starting to see amazing consumer technology and software hit Indian markets. You had things like Redbus, Flipkart. So, but finance didn't have any of that happening. So that excitement for engineering, the excitement for building new stuff that others hadn't built, that's how it happened. And that's been happening ever since. So that's a decade now of being in capital markets. But in the meanwhile, I've continued to work on my hobby projects, open source projects very actively. I released a new JavaScript library, I think 2 days ago. Just came out of another project that I was working on. And in 2020, we founded FOSS United Foundation. When I say we, Rushabh from ERP Next, which is one of the largest open source projects in India, me and our teams, we decided to start a nonprofit specifically focused at reviving perhaps a lot of the lost open source community spirit that we had in India a decade prior. And here we are. So I continue to build technology in capital markets. I'm involved in open source stuff as I have been for the last 2 decades. And I greatly enjoy it. It's still my number one hobby and passion. And yeah.
Lovely, lovely, amazing story. Thanks for sharing that and setting context for today's conversation. Maybe we sort of zoom out now. You've been in the ecosystem this long. You've, of course, built an org, a technology org, and built a team there, as well as on the side, you built, the open source community. You've added to that, and you keep tinkering yourself, right? So a lot has happened. You've seen an evolution, at least a decade and even longer for sure, right? What do you see about the Indian developer ecosystem? What are your key observations, right, over the years? If we dial back 10 to 15 years, we have millions of developers. What are key traits of this ecosystem? Right? What strengths does the Indian development community have, right? And then maybe even some areas of improvement and weaknesses.
I think it's a bit of a peculiar case. In the 2000s, when all of this was just shaping up, when technology as we know it today, especially internet technologies, were slowly becoming mainstream, there were very strong communities, developer communities, open source communities in India. The Wikipedia movement in itself was like a big thing from which a lot of open source developers were born, really. But that is the very nature of any nascent ecosystem. The people who are really committed, passionate, dedicated, and people who are enthusiastic, they're the ones who show up when a community is forming. But as we hit the late 2000s and early 2010s, that's when the startup boom really started happening. And the IT services industry, that was on a different track altogether. But ironically, what's happened with the startup boom, with the explosion of our startup ecosystem, is that while the number of techies and developers in India really exploded exponentially because it creates opportunities, the open source tinkering ecosystem shrunk. Many of the very active open source communities just faded out. People who were the early enthusiasts, they found jobs, they aged and matured, but new communities didn't really emerge in that sense. And so GitHub says that there are apparently 10 million Indian developers on GitHub, which is a mind-bogglingly large number. But if you look at the number of open source projects that have come out of India in the last, let's say, 5 years or 10 years, it is disproportionately small. When you put it against that 10 million number, it would be close to zero. And yet we have a handful of really good projects that have come out. So this disproportionately small number, I think, warrants like a proper sociological or anthropological study. How could the number of developers, techies, grow exponentially high, but at the same time, communities vanish and shrink, and the number of projects that you'd expect, the number of open source projects especially, that you'd expect to go up, remain stagnant. And that's even more peculiar because when we say developer, 99% of the cases, we're talking about developers who are familiar with open source technologies, be it databases, be it JavaScript front-end systems, be it programming languages. We're all talking about an entire open source stack. So an average developer is well versed in many of these open source stacks. I think that's something that has bugged me very personally. And one of the reasons we started Force United Foundation in 2020 was specifically to find answers to these questions also. And I think that's a bit of a cultural, I don't really have clear answers, but it has industry plus deep cultural issues driving this. I must say, although our startup ecosystem has exploded, the technology startup ecosystem, you'd find that most Indian tech startups are led by business folks, not really technologists, techies, or engineers. And you'd see, if you look, you'd notice that all the prominent voices in our tech startup industry are not tech voices. There are barely any tech voices at all. They're all business voices. And that is a symptom of, that's a signal that shows us what could be one of the many factors driving this huge disparity. So, yeah, it's not something that, it's something, like I said, it's something that bugs me greatly. Technology startups should have prominent engineering voices, hackers, spirited folks who talk about technology, who enable technology, who enable and encourage contributions, open source contributions. In a tech company led by business folks who are completely disconnected from the spirit of hacking or the passion for technology in itself, it's natural that they won't drive a developer-centric or a technology-centric culture in their organizations or encourage developers to participate or produce open source software. So when you spread this out across a large ecosystem at a systemic level, the disparities start making sense. So, sorry, I think I ranted a bit, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it was an interesting observation. You're right. There has been quantity growth, right? And there's probably been quality growth as well in terms of quality of developers, but at the same time, contributions to a certain, to the open source community is limited, right? I vaguely remember when I started my career 20 plus years ago, I started my career at Yahoo, right? And it was, the open source culture was so rich within Yahoo, and the kind of people we hired, such amazing stuff came out of Yahoo, right, in those days and later. And, then for almost a decade or more, there was very little, correct? You pointed out two things, right? Leadership has to maybe think differently and have, different aspirations or a combination of, and then allow a little more creativity, a little more openness on the technology side. in business as well, with a business mindset, and maybe think long term, correct?
Yeah.
So that is one angle. Are you seeing a little more of that? Of course, you're doing that. Are you starting to see, are there initial signs, if you say last 2, 3, 4 years with your community and what you've done at FOSS United, etc.? That is one part. Second part is there any other aspect? Can you imbibe this culture sooner? Let's say at engineering colleges or during education, right? Is there an opportunity to start doing that from a different angle as well?
So FOSS United does a bunch of things, and one of the things, one of those obvious things that we do is we organize meetups and events. We don't organize, the volunteers, the community organizers, and we help facilitate. And that has been happening at a very large scale. We are seeing tons of tech communities self-organize, open source communities, and self-organize across cities in India and do this. So that points to a very big void or vacuum that has existed. However, leadership, in terms of leadership in large organizations, I think it's still a little too early. We're seeing organizations come forward and sponsor some of these open source events. So that is a sign, but organizations always sponsor stuff. So I don't know if that's the right sign. So if you ask me, really, are we seeing the needle move in terms of leadership and management thinking? I don't think so yet. And right now, how the ecosystem has fared in the last 12 months or so with the fund crunch and all the uncertainties, I think open source contributions and encouraging developer culture would be the lowest item on people's agendas, naturally. But it's not something that you do one fine day. It's a culture. It has to be slowly inculcated, so it becomes a system. And the second question was, I'm trying to recollect, sorry.
The second question was education, maybe earlier, younger, from a developer perspective, when they're learning, when they're growing. Is that an opportunity? Is that you see that happening at colleges, or at earlier stages?
Yes, we're seeing that happening at a very large scale. And I think it's always happened. So most of our events, activities, hackathons, community organized stuff, I think is populated by college students. Lots of spirit, energy, inquisitiveness, that drive to build, write software, learn. But industry is a big driving factor. Imagine a young, spirited engineer, developer, self-taught developer comes out of a college. They enter the industry, they join, let's say, a startup. But if there's no culture of encouragement and driving open source participation and contributions, then the individual is left to themselves to further their interests, to find personal time to make contributions, and that becomes completely disparate from the day-to-day engineering work that people do in their environments. And I think that perhaps extinguishes the spirit to a significant percent. And it's anecdotal, but I've spoken to countless young engineers and students, and this has been my takeaway. So the industry is a big deciding driver and deciding factor of how an engineer, a young spirited engineer, undergoes personal and professional development. And not having a contribution sharing open source culture kills that spirit.
Makes sense. I think we're all, in the same ecosystem, and everybody has to contribute. I think that's sort of the headline, right? You want to talk a little bit about what you've done at Zerodha in terms of organization, how you built a team, how you built a culture, what are some guiding principles for you, right? In how you consume open source, how you build your technology, how you keep innovating. Just headline this. take us back now. It's a 10-year journey. What did you do? How did you think about your principles right at the beginning? Because you want to start a company, and then somewhere along the way, maybe you saw disproportionate scale, right? And you were maybe a small group. But talk us through that journey a little bit, and philosophy most important.
So we have a very small team, tech team at Zerodha, and it's a bit unconventional by industry standards. The way it's structured, we are a flat team. Everyone's a developer, two designers. Everyone else is a developer who works on whatever has to be worked on. So, and it has grown very, very organically. So 10.5 years, I guess, at this point. And in 2013, when we started Zerodha Tech, like I said earlier, there was no roadmap. So I'd go personally sit with folks at Zerodha, people who were handling forms, people who were picking up customer support calls, understand their workflows and help build little Python script like automations for them. So the digitization started absolutely from first principles. So the idea to build a consumer-facing tech product at Zerodha, I think happened a year and a half later. Because logically, we had to digitize the business from the inside out first. So I was at it for several months, and at a certain point, I felt that needed more hands to help me. So that's when we hired our first engineer. And a few months later, when both of us had our hands full, we got another engineer in. So that's how we have grown the team. Even the last person we hired 2.5 years ago, they came in exactly from that perspective. 28 or 29 of us had a hands full, and we needed one more person. So we got another person. So it has been extremely organic. Absolutely from the bottoms up approach. And that also has reflected heavily on how we build technology, products, structured stuff. So our team is lean. The way we think of technology stacks and products is also very lean from a first principles perspective. And we've never built anything aiming for any metrics. So in 2014 is when we one day figured that it actually makes sense to try and build a user-facing investment platform. So this decision, this brainwave happened a year and a half after starting Zerodha Tech. So we didn't even start Zerodha Tech thinking that, oh, we'll build an investment platform. So we built it absolutely from the first principles. We never foresaw 500,000 users or 1 million users or anything. So in 2020, when the COVID fiasco happened, we had 2 million users. And over the next 6 months, we grew to 7 or 8 million users. That was insane growth, completely unprecedented. Nobody in the world really foresaw what would happen in those 8 months. And yet, we were 29, 30 people at that point. And today also we are 30 people in the tech engineering team. But the systems we'd built over the prior 7 years, the engineering decisions we'd taken to build things slowly, properly, keep the infrastructure as lean as possible, it all paid off when the scale happened. So we never built it for 10 million users. We built it for an uncertain future. So when you build software for an uncertain future, it could be 500,000, 1 million, 10 million, 100 million. Then certain architectural first principles kick in. You keep your technology and architecture as simple as possible, as dead simple as possible. You reduce dependencies to an absolute minimum. You don't rely on third-party services. You optimize your software to max out performance from the available hardware. And you make everything modular enough so that stuff can be swapped out, because technology changes. And what you built in 2014 will probably make no sense in 2020. So there shouldn't be a point where you're stuck with a massive old system which can't be replaced. So it has to be modular enough to rebuild it over a period of time, like the ship of Theseus. So these decisions were not taken foreseeing rapid growth at Zerodha. We didn't even know if we'd ever hit 1 million customers. So, and even today, our net infrastructure bill is a laughably tiny fraction of our competitors in the industry. And yet we handle like 5-6x the scale and volume. So that's the myth that as a technology organization scales, as the number of users who interact with distributed systems over the internet scales, infrastructure also has to scale exponentially. The number of people has to scale. It's simply not true. It entirely depends on how you build things, the nature of business you are in. So super simple common sense principles. I've written extensively on this, some of these concrete principles that we follow, concrete techniques that we follow. So those techniques that we've been using in 2014, they are working great for us today. We continue to apply those same simple first principle common sense decisions. So I'll cite one example, something that we hear very often: monolith versus microservices. Where we have a product to build, you know what, let's go with microservices. I think that is outright the wrong approach. You want to build a product, you start with the logical units that go in, and you factor in those considerations. The result could be one service, 3 services, 5 services, a distributed system, non-distributed system. These are all second order outcomes. But if you start out by saying, oh, I have a product to build, I will use microservices, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You end up using whatever architecture, whatever design pattern. So for us, it's still absolute simple, basic first principles thinking. It could be a bash script that solves the problem. It could be a sophisticated distributed system. Pick the right approach for the right task, right job.
Very interesting, very fascinating. Couple of follow-up questions here, right? And relating back to the previous part in terms of how business leadership also has to kind of align and enable technology functions and technology orgs to make such meaningful long-term sort of decisions, right? While there could be some short-term trade-offs, right? So maybe you talk about both your core philosophy, but also, Nitin and Nikhil, and their, what did they enable you to do? How was that conversation? And were there any trade-offs for doing all of these things right, doing it from first principles and keeping it simple? What did you trade off?
So absolutely every decision is a trade-off. Every product decision, business decision, technical and engineering decision. But the one thing one key tenet that we've inculcated from the absolute beginning is that there should be collaboration and there should be mutual trust between different stakeholders in an organization. So typically you have a tech team, you have a management team, you have a product team, and there are layers between each of these teams. Requirements flow from the management, which is often invisible, via product managers to one specific tech team in a large tech team. And they're supposed to just build those things out. We don't operate like that at all. When you want to build something, be it a business decision, be it a front-facing feature decision, be it a risk management financial decision, the right stakeholders could be a designer, to developers, somebody from the business department, somebody who's a financial domain expert. We sit together without hierarchies and we objectively discuss and debate what has to be done or what has to be not done, whether it's worth doing at all or not. So that's become our culture. We have an internal forum. It's a self-hosted discourse instance where all 1,000 employees across support, compliance, physical account openings, absolutely every single person at Zerodha is on. And anybody can propose an idea. Anybody can ask any question. Absolutely no holds barred. Anybody can spot an issue. Anybody can voice a disagreement. And anybody else can respond to it. CEO, CTO, whatever, none of those things matter. So that culture that's become our philosophy and culture over a period of time. Collaboration in a very non-hierarchical manner. And that also builds mutual respect. You understand why a certain decision is being taken. You understand why a certain thing is being shot down. The non-technical people also have to understand the engineering complexity. Sometimes there's a cool feature we all like to do, but it's just too risky to do it. So the people who propose the feature need to understand why that decision is being taken. And sometimes there are features or changes that an engineer may not be able to relate to, but they also have to understand why the business has to take such a decision. So simple face-to-face conversations and objective decision-making is our framework. And that people have to stick to consensus and objectivity. That's a key inviolable tenet. I could, just because the CTO proposes something doesn't mean it'll be done. And the management has to be, the leadership has to be on that level. You have to suspend your egos, and you have to put in that effort to build that mutual respect, to listen to every dissenting voice and considering it all objectively. And then the culture permeates. So in all organizations, culture always permeates like this from top to the bottom. So that's what we've done.
Yeah. No, that's very cool, refreshing, and an important reminder for everybody building an org, right, or starting to build an org, right? Would you say these tenets and this inspiration or this background for you, and maybe even for when you had those conversations with founders, that came from open source, or did you also look elsewhere for motivation or inspiration of you love how somebody else had built an org, or those principles? Where did this, from an origin perspective, who do you give credit to?
So I've never read any business or startup books, so I don't really know how typically businesses or startups operate. I'm not a fan of the fail fast sort of mantra. So my foundation has been that of, first principles, common sense, open source. So I would definitely say that the open source way of building things, the open source philosophy has been that's my mental model. It was 20 years ago. It is today. If you look at most open source projects, the ones that really change the world, there aren't thousands of people working on it. It's typically 2 or 3 or 5 people who build and maintain insanely high quality technologies. Of course, with the collaboration of people who show up once in a while, who stay on, etc. So when we started building the tech stack at Zerodha, that is exactly the principles I started out with, because that was my only worldview. So to even think that the idea of picking a proprietary licensed database from someone to build a product is just, I can't fathom that. So then these things permeate. Nitin doesn't have a technology background. He's not a techie, but I'd say that today he's more a techie than most people in the industry. But he's a great person. That's why I like him. He's a great person. He understands and finance is his domain expertise. That's his DNA, finance and capital markets. And then it's just mutual respect. So if you have mutual respect for each other's principles and philosophies, and you combine them meaningfully, let's say tech expertise and a certain way of building tech and products, and financial expertise and very first principles grounded understanding of the real financial reality, what customers expect, etc. You combine those skills and philosophies, then that intersection is where results really happen. So the philosophies and culture at Zerodha, it has been an amalgamation of philosophies and cultures of decent people with mutual respect, who are grounded in reality. Despite being a finance person, Nitin has never had a benchmark to attain, getting 1 million users or getting to X revenue. He's never been like that. And for me as a technologist, getting to X revenue or getting to Y a number of users or user base, etc., has never been a priority in that sense. So we just, these philosophies work well together. And the people who work with us, our teams, our peer group, they're all out of a very similar wavelength.
Helpful. No, absolutely. That makes sense. Couple of takeaways from one of your earlier points, and I want to use that to talk about, talent building, hiring people with the right attitude, with, to add to the ethos and slowly to the culture, right? And to, how easy or difficult has that been? Of course, it's a small team, right? Second, from an org structure, you also mentioned talking about hierarchical structures and product and how information flows. And I think you guys have made a conscious choice of not having product managers, correct? So talk a little bit about that aspect about, product versus, just the tech team owning product completely and not having to have somebody specifically linked up for product, right? And then the broader angle of just the talent landscape, right? How hiring is hard, how retention seems super hard for most of us and most of the ecosystem, right? And how have you, tackled that?
So we don't have dedicated product managers, but we have product management as a perspective, as a skill. So our philosophy is not to build layers between teams, but to make sure teams overlap where skills and culture is exchanged. So over a period of time, and not everybody has a knack for product management or product first thinking, and that's absolutely fine. But the people who have that knack have built the ability to manage products well. This is within the tech team. This is also outside the tech team. Certain people in the support team, or certain people in the business analyst team, people with the right knack have built product skills, product management skills, product first thinking. And that's the best outcome. You ideally don't want to have one layer where a certain skill is concentrated, where a certain understanding is concentrated. If you're trying to build an organization for the longer term, you want these skills and these perspectives, mostly in product first thinking, to permeate as wide as possible. As many people in the organization to think of the product from a very product first view. So that's what we've done. And this way of collaborating openly, dissenting and objectively agreeing on decisions builds these skills over a period of time. And so we don't have dedicated product managers, but we have a lot of product management, which is spread across different teams. And about hiring, I think the word talent and retention, so we don't really look at people in the sense of talent or retention. And an organization, at least the way I understand how an organization should be, you don't retain people, but it should be, you can look at it from the other angle. The organization should be good enough for people to want to stay there. So you don't do tricks to retain people. You build a good organization where people genuinely want to just stay. And it'll never be 100%, which is absolutely fine. But if a large number of people want to stay because it's a good environment and there's personal and professional and financial, obviously, fulfillment, then that's the ideal place to be. So that is the philosophy that we operate with. And that's really the culture. So in the tech team, I think maybe 95% of the people who have come in right out of college with no industry experience whatsoever, zero financial experience, but most of them were tinkerers, hackers, people who fiddled around, and none of them had, most of them never had in-depth tech skills. But we filtered for certain traits, the general philosophies of working with others, general attitude and approach to life, and the ability to learn skills. So somebody could come in as a fresher, young techie, but if they have the right attitude, they can build up skills rapidly. In 3 or 6 months, they could be contributing to very critical programs and systems. So you never look for people with X years of experience with a certain technology, but just young folks. And that's the approach that has worked. Filtering, looking for people not just with technical skills, but the right kind of attitude and the right expectations in general as well. And I think every single person in the tech team whom I've hired, I set expectations very clearly. I tell them that stockbroking is a really difficult financial industry, heavily regulated. Tons of work is just mundane and drudgery. And the kind of regulatory stuff that we have to work with is crazy. Not something that is compatible with the spirit of engineering. However, that's 80% of the time. 20% of the time, we get to work on amazing engineering problems, amazing product problems that solve problems for millions of people. And despite the nature of work, 20% great stuff, 80% just drudgery, we'll all have fun and we'll all be on the same level and just hang out and go forward trying to build an organization. So you set those expectations clearly. I never sell dreams to anyone saying that Zerodha, I've never sold those dreams saying, oh, Zerodha is going to be number one or big or anything. Like maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work. So the people who are okay with that, then people who are looking for the right things out of an organization, those are the people who've ended up in the team. And over a period of time, we've all stuck together.
Lovely. I think there's so many nuggets for everybody to take away from what you've shared. So thanks for that. Right. I'm sure you also, you are in Bangalore, you are in part of the rest of the startup ecosystem, while you stand apart and unique in your own approach and how the firm has been built and your org has been built. And you, of course, write your tenets and your blogs and stuff for everybody to consume and learn from, correct? And you must be speaking to so many other engineering leaders, business leaders, in terms of, how they're building their organizations. Most of them venture capital funded, right? And with a lot of capital, large teams, etc. Any takeaways there of, what you advise them, where things can be different, even though their probably incentives and motivations are fairly non-aligned with the Zerodha approach. But what key takeaways? How do you see this? This difference and this. Where can people still find common ground? Is probably my question.
I think so. I think Nitin always cites this quote, and I've started liking it too. Charlie Munger, legendary investor, he said, "Show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome," and something like that.
Yeah.
And that really explains tons of stuff around us. So if you're a startup and you take money from an investor and you afford them certain rights, and investors don't give money to organizations for free or to build philosophies. And most investors give money to make returns. And that's absolutely fair. That's the entire point of investment. So it really depends on whom an organization is taking money from. If the investors' philosophies aren't really aligned, there are investors who want to see businesses grow, sustain long-term, investors who are passionate about technology and R&D. And there are investors who just want returns. So it really comes down to that. The moment you take money from an organization, an investor, whose incentives are not aligned with yours, then questions of culture, technology, etc., just go out of the way. The incentives are completely misaligned. So I've heard of countless instances of investors forcing startup founders to hire more, to show growth, increase headcounts. That is an absurd proposition to me in general also. And I'd say 95% of those haven't really done well. I mean, such approaches. So it really comes down to that. And the only meaningful thing I could say is if there's a startup and they're trying to raise funding from the right kind of investor who'll push them for the right kinds of things. And if the investor's incentive is just to inflate numbers and make returns, then the question of tech, open source culture, etc., is absolutely meaningless on day one.
Interesting. No, I think some hard-hitting points there, and good to remember, hey, can we play that balance? Can we be the right partner, at least from our perspective as a fund, to young startups and founders? So, important reminder. Any companies out there, despite being on the other side of the fence, that you admire, that you think are doing a fair job? Any names that that you come across? Any people that you've met, right? You want to point out and say, hey, they've done fairly well, and how they've managed it? Putting you on the spot a little bit there.
Very few, that's a rarity. But there are a few smaller startups with whom we partnered who managed to stay lean, who managed to become profitable. I don't want to name anyone in particular,
Sure.
But I'll say that it's a rarity where you see an organization, you think, oh, they've done well. They don't have 1,000 people where 800 people are trying to figure out what to do. So very, very few organizations. But on the flip side, there are tons of open source projects out there that are really absolutely role models, projects that the entire world depends on, built meaningfully by a handful of people. So that is always astounding to me. And how little society understands the open source building blocks on which it functions, or how society hasn't evolved enough to value the technical contributions of passionate people, hobbies who build these things. I mean, even the Mars rovers, even our moon rovers, even extraterrestrial stuff that we send out runs on open source software built by passionate hobbies. So that to me is always way more astounding than businesses in general.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Very valuable. We've opened up the floor for questions, so some have started to come in, right? And we wanted to cover, the buzz phrase of the time, which is, this sort of paradigm shift that we're in the middle of, which is Gen AI, right? Maybe, you talk a little bit about what is your opinion? What do you take out of this? Is it as big as it seems to be? How are you looking at it, broadly as well as within Zerodha, right? And that's one of the questions from Sunil as well. And we also wanted to say, how are you looking at this whole wave coming in, and what does it mean for the future?
So I spent 3 years researching on a small subset of AI, neurocomputation. This was the late 2000s. And
yeah, this was also your PhD.
Yeah, that was my PhD.
Yeah.
So in a subset called neurocomputation.
Okay.
So what was state of the art then in overall in AI/machine learning? And AI is a very, very vague term. So I'm just using it in a very loose general sense here. What was state of the art back then was nothing really. And over the last decade, things steadily progressed. Deep learning became a thing. It paved the way to a large number of breakthroughs. But I think what's happened in the last couple of years, the huge breakthroughs, as someone who was a research insider and as someone who has been a keen observer of the field, I think they're very different, the recent breakthroughs. And one of the reasons, and in academia, I greatly enjoyed my time, the research. It had computation, it had neural networks. We solved interesting problems. It was fascinating. But I decided not to pursue that specifically because it was fascinating and not very practical in that sense. And then it took many, many years for it to, the field itself to hit those big breakthroughs. The Transformer paper in 2017, that in itself was 7-8 years after this period. So all of this has been really built up on 50, 60, 70 years worth of computational AI, ML research. So this specific subset, large language, and what the kind of things they've exhibited in the recent breakthroughs, I think is massive. And the implications are also massive, more than just generating images or writing poetry. some of the things that these models are capable of, their implications are, I think we are only beginning to understand. And even around me, very anecdotally, there's also a lot of hype and frenzy, as we know. But anecdotally, we're starting to see some of the things that you rely on humans for, especially white-collar tasks, being very easily replaced by some of these technologies where they deliver far better results. So I think the implications for white-collar jobs is quite serious. There's this whole argument that this is what's happened with all technological breakthroughs. There'll be job losses. New jobs always come up and take it, replace what was lost. I don't really know. I don't have a definitive answer, but I don't think it's that black and white here. Because these technologies are very multi-dimensional. They don't just do one thing. You can make them do a crazy number of things across industries and spectrums. And for developers, it poses it's interesting for developers. So I've stopped, I think 90-95% of my web searches have just dropped. I used to be on Stack Overflow 20-30 times a day. I don't go on Stack Overflow anymore at all. I get pointed, direct, technical, nuanced answers from, let's say, GPT-4. So when I'm stuck with a technical problem, I just ask, I get an answer. That was never ever possible before with any technology prior. And I personally become very reliant on these tools to aid me as a developer. So for experienced developers, it's a huge productivity boost. You don't want to focus on writing 20 if conditions or figuring out how a certain library has to be interfaced or orchestrated. You want to solve a problem. But for junior developers, it could mean different things, people, budding developers, and the kind of work that you're involved in, because some of these models produce quite good code. They can't build entire sophisticated suites of software yet, but they can produce really good code. And a lot of jobs, a large number of IT, perhaps services jobs, you don't really have to do a lot of creative engineering. You just have to patch stuff and move on. And that patching can really be done by some of these systems quite well today. So the implications for those kinds of jobs don't seem very positive to me, in my personal view. And for young developers who are learning, who are building their worldviews and practices, relying on some of these tools, I don't know how it will affect the learning process. For experienced developers, it's a huge productivity boost. So it's a little tricky, depending on the kind of tech work an engineer does, depending on the experience level, the same tool has very different implications.
That makes a lot of sense. Within Zerodha, have you already started using it? Like you said, of course, your personal behavior as a developer is seemingly drastically changed already. But within the organization, are you already building a roadmap? Are you already thinking through, hey, how are we going to incorporate this for more efficiency, for more quality, for better customer, experience? What are a couple of headlines that you could share?
So in the tech team, we've started using these technologies heavily. It's a huge productivity boost. The amount of time we're saving is immense. Things for
so you're going to hire even slower than you have always done.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So that's common sense. That's a given in the tech team. Huge productivity boost, immense amounts of time saved. Outside the tech team, from outside the productivity perspective, we are still experimenting. We're still R&D, just like we do with any other technology. Just because there's an amazing AI model doesn't mean we want to jump on it. So we're doing R&D. Text summarization is an obvious benefit. Some complex text summarization tasks, legal text summarization, etc., we are experimenting. And getting concise summaries of large amounts of text can be a huge productivity boost to non-technical people. To do quality checks of, let's say, the tickets that we respond to customers with, We're doing some experiments there. So a bunch of these experiments from a productivity perspective for our technical folks and non-technical folks, but nothing customer facing. I don't think there are any obvious low-hanging fruits where these technologies will come solve a big problem when it comes to people investing and money and buying and selling shares. So nothing customer facing in that sense, but lots of obvious language, code-related productivity experiments.
Got it. Makes sense. I think that seems to be the broader consensus as well. People are, be cautious about what they put in front of customers, right? Because I think, of course, the technology and fundamental infra is also evolving. There are still some issues, but you can still start using it for internal efficiency and growth. Right? A couple of questions that have come up already. I'll highlight one or two if you can take a shot at that. Praveen is asking, how can I strengthen my technical knowledge as a non-tech founder? And you spoke a little bit about Nitin having come from a non-tech background, as now is fairly, can speak the language, right, and can do that. What should a non-technical founder, approach when they're building a technical sort of a product-led business, right? Any guidance there?
So non-technical founders should find technical folks with whom they can work, like a technical co-founder, and build a good partnership. If a non-technical person or a management looks at technology as a cost center, just as a means of enabling something, and the idea is just to create a tech team and siphon off requests to them, that's not sustainable. You can't build a good technology or product company that is long-lasting, and the probability, the odds are really low. So you have to find someone, a technical person with whom you share your philosophies, with a person who shares your philosophies and is really on the same personal wavelength as you. And then you have to trust each other with each other's skills. A technical co-founder or a technical person should, let's say, trust the non-technical person with their domain expertise and vice versa. And they should meet in between, be willing to change each other's worldviews slightly based on mutual trust. So mutual trust and alignment of general philosophies and the belief in vision. Easier said than done, finding such people, but
sure.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Question from Mayank, and I don't know if this is directly relevant. Web3 technologies in financial services markets, in your regulated markets, have you tinkered with that? Have you guys used something? Is that, have you explored the use of Web3 technologies, blockchain and other related technologies for what you have built at Zerodha? Does it make sense? Do you have any exposure there?
No, we haven't explored. There's no need to explore. There's no use cases that fit. And I'm a skeptic of the term Web3. I've written about this, in fact. Yeah. The underlying technology, distributed cryptographic immutable ledgers, that's a great premise. But the term Web3 is very loose and concocted by a certain... it's not a technical term. And it wasn't really created by technologists. It was created by a certain group of VCs to further their own, financial programs and agendas. So I'm a big skeptic of that term, and that term seems to mean something else entirely for each person. But speaking of distributed ledgers or the underlying blockchain technology, nothing. There's in a heavily regulated market, especially the way Indian markets are structured, brokers don't execute transactions, exchanges execute transactions. So every investment, every order or trade that hits our system, we send it directly off to the exchanges. So it doesn't fit in anywhere.
Got it. Abhishek had asked a question right up front when we were talking about, our developer ecosystem and why open source has not been easily, it's not permeated as much, particularly in the last decade. His question is, do you think this might be the result of limited capital available to Indian companies as compared to Western companies? You think there's a correlation to capital availability to, companies having a certain mindset and developer, open source mindset kicking on, or you just think it's more philosophical?
I think it's also our socioeconomic background, not just philosophy. The Indian socioeconomic state and our history is very different from our Western counterparts. So, and this tech boom in India is very new. We've leapfrogged from zero technology to a lot of consumer-facing technology in no time. It wasn't a slow, gradual evolution where we could build strong foundations of, let's say, developer communities, research, technology in academia, etc. So we leapfrogged. And when you leapfrog without some of those foundations that are typically built over many years, it behaves very differently. So it's not a fair comparison. And we are still we're a developing country. We're very price sensitive. Our consumers are price sensitive. And that also is a factor. So when most Indian organizations, startups want to when they crack something, they want to hold it very close to their hearts, like a secret sauce. And that idea of sharing in the open, when it really comes to success and technology, organization success, which reflects on technology inside the organization, isn't very prevalent. And complex socio-economic historical reasons for it, culture, as we say. So that I've seen, even trivial things, even trivial technologies that can be easily replicated over a weekend. Many organizations think that that's the secret sauce. And even the idea of open sourcing or opening it seems abhorrent to them. So that understanding, that also plays a key role.
Fairly complex. I think it's an evolution. And maybe, like you said, because we've leapfrogged a few stages, right? Maybe we have to also fill the gaps, right, as we go along. And that will hopefully make it more open, more richer, and more mature in that sense over a period of time.
That's the hope.
Yeah. There's a question from Ravi, and then I have one more question. We'll sort of wrap it up. I think we're past the hour mark, so thanks for that little extra time. Ravi says, with HashiCorp now and previously Red Hat, Mongo, and Akka, there's debate about open source business models, right? What's right, what's not? Do you have a view there on the business model side of, how open source platforms, of course, have evolved to become businesses, right? What is happening? What is your take on the state of the union today?
I think we are in that intermediate period where the concept of revenues and building business out of open source organizations are playing out. Funding, or the lack thereof, in open source has always been a hot topic. But over the last 5 years, that started to shift. We're seeing a lot of venture capital specifically flow into open source projects. And that's a sign that it has now been seen as a viable business model. What's happened with HashiCorp is very unfortunate. It was kind of a bait and switch, build a product with community strength, community support over a decade, and then flip that. That's very unfortunate.
Yeah, that doesn't set a right precedent for everybody to go that route and for the right reasons for the community.
Absolutely,
right?
It doesn't. It could have been done in so many different ways, but there also, I think, the incentives explain it. They went public, they raised huge amounts of capital, and post that, open source or not, the incentives are not really about technology anymore. It's about fulfilling So I think, and we've also seen, I think, some 4-5 Indian open source projects get funded in the last 2-3 years. So it's and there are examples for very successful open source, commercially successful open source companies out there. Postgres is a great example, and it's one of the oldest battle tested. I'm not going to cite Red Hat because they're like an anomaly, outlier. But Postgres has been an insanely good product, which has matured immensely with community support, adopted globally, and the organizations that contribute to Postgres are commercially successful. They make money from Postgres optimization, consulting services, etc. And so there are viable business models, but if you're looking at massive amount taking, if you're thinking of open source projects taking huge amounts of funding, then it's no longer open source or not. It's typically what happens when you take huge amounts of funding. So it's all slowly playing out. We're seeing companies take small amounts of funding, massive amounts of funding. And I think in the next 5 years, we will have much clearer pictures on the viability of various open source commercial models.
Makes sense. Makes sense. No, thanks. Thanks for sharing that. I have one last question, and I think we can wrap. Flipping back to the GenAI part of the conversation and mixing open source there is, of course, closed source LLMs, right? OpenAI and others. And then there is there's Llama, and what is your read of this interplay of this core sort of utility / infrastructure layer in GenAI that is coming from combination of closed source and open source? How do you think this is going to play out? What is your view going forward?
So the way these models are, for them to be created, for them to be trained, you require massive amounts of capital. You need to spend unimaginable amounts of money on hardware, and then the infrastructure and the people who have to run all of it. So you can't just have a meaningful amount of money to create some of these models. You need to have absurd amounts of money. And that's one of the reasons why we aren't really seeing truly open source large models. Although we've started to see truly open source, smaller LLMs. So the commoditization of this stuff is inevitable. When you don't need to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to train large models, the incentive structures change, and more people, communities, other open source organizations at some point will be able to come in and compete and build. Right now, capital is one of the biggest entry barriers. So it's a matter of time, and these technologies will become extremely commoditized. And when that happens, that is when the open source model will just subsume any sort of commercial, the kind of large commercial enterprises that we are seeing right now. And that's what's happened with every single technology.
Yeah, no, that's interesting how this evolution is going to start. Today, there are capital barriers to entry in terms of building these out, but hopefully quickly they should come down, right? I think that cost curve in some sense, should come down, and then we'll see more open stuff out there, right?
Yeah.
No, awesome. No, this has been such an amazing conversation. So much to take away, so much to learn. Maybe a parting thought, what are you most excited about next 5-10 years? Right? What's your vision for that? You also want to give a shout out to things that you're working on, you're so passionate about, of course, open source, about tech policy. I think you do something with Takshashila, right? You want to give a shout out to some of these things. Please do that and just share something with the audience about, hey, how do you look at the next 10 years of technology broadly and for all of us in the ecosystem? And what can we do? How can we do better?
I honestly don't really have a clear vision of the next 2 years, let alone 10 years. So I'm very poor in that sense of trying to visualize very specific things at a large scale. But I think we will see bigger breakthroughs, far more interesting breakthroughs in the field of AI and machine learning. That seems to be a given, and I am cautiously optimistic and paranoid about what is to come. And these technologies will have insane implications for humanity in general. So there is that paranoid excitement specifically for those. And with some of the work that we're doing with FOSS United, I'm very excited about this, about OASIS, OASIS is a project under FOSS United. It's an alliance. It's not a project. It's an alliance. And it stands for Open Source Alliance for Social Innovation and Sustainability. That acronym was generated by GPT-4.
Okay. Wow. Appropriate.
Yeah, so some of the projects that we've been doing at FOSS United, specifically for using open source, FOSS for social good, social development, it has now morphed into an alliance of multiple organizations who are all aligned on this. Tech organizations, civil society organizations. So the idea there is that technologies today, especially open source technologies, have matured immensely. There are certain class of no code, low code kind of technologies make what was previously unthinkable for many organizations very thinkable. You install something and you don't need to build a tech team. You can build that tech capacity to run your organization on some of these platforms that have matured over the last 3-4 years. And I think that is very exciting, specifically for social development organizations who don't have any tech capacity. There are organizations who work with children, conservation, soil, water, sanitation, tons of organizations who work on insanely critical societal problems with practically zero tech. And the social development world can never attract tech talent because you can never compete with the industry. And that's very natural. But some of these technologies now can bridge that gap and also provide a way for the tech community, the open source community, to volunteer and work with organizations who have real societal impact. So that's been a project that we've been running at FOSS United. Lots of people are interested, tech orgs, social development orgs, young interns, college kids. Everybody's looking for a project. You meet a young engineer who's just out of college. He's like, where can I start contributing to open source? What do I build? Everybody's looking for a project, and there aren't unlimited projects out there to pick from. But in the social development world, which is
there are problems to be solved.
Yeah, exactly. So in the social development world, there are an infinite number of problems that techies have never looked at. So bridging that gap is something I'm very excited about. So the OASIS Summit is happening on the 14th of September in Bangalore.
Wow, lovely. And we'll give a shout out to that. That's amazing.
Yeah, and I hope people just walk in, kids, techies, technology companies, social development organizations, just to make this bridging happen. And yeah, so lots of those things are happening. With Rainmatter Foundation, we're doing some critical work in critical areas, climate change, environmental degradation. So I'm happy about that, but not joyful because those are existential things.
Sure.
So, yeah.
No, thank you for sharing all of that. I think the headline message is we got to keep contributing. We got to come together and move things forward, right, in a cohesive fashion. And that's a strong reminder for all of us. And that's sort of one of my key takeaways from today's conversation, right? So really appreciate your time. More importantly, your candid, answers and your humility, which I'm taking away. So thank you so much. I think everybody's really benefited from this, right? And we can still go on. We'll hopefully do a part 2 of this sometime and talk about some specific aspects, dive deeper, right? This has been so fascinating, so amazing. Kailash, really, really thank you for joining us this afternoon, right? And wish you guys all the best, correct? And hope there are more companies out there that follow your kind of philosophy and build lasting organizations.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Arjun. It was a great conversation. Thanks for inviting me and hosting me. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Signing off from Speciality Talks. Very special edition. Take care. Bye-bye.